Justin Trudeau continues to divide the country, lash out at the unvaccinated, and blame everybody but himself for the latest lockdowns. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. And so today I'm going to focus on our Prime Minister and the way that he is handling himself during what is the latest round of lockdowns. It's 2 years all over again. We're back to 14 days to flatten the curve. And rather than have a Prime Minister who is leading the way, inspiring Canadians, trying to justify and explain the situation, and really just showing his competence and his compassion for his fellow countrymen during this difficult time, instead of acting like a normal person and a responsible leader that you would want during a pandemic, Justin Trudeau instead is basically acting like a spoiled brat. He's acting like a baby, and he continues to blame everybody but himself, particularly as we've seen over and over again since the election, really before then, but his rhetoric and his hatred and his anger towards the unvaccinated is just out of control right now. It's like the volume is up at 100%, more than 100%, and he is just really becoming unhinged. So here is the latest example. On Wednesday, during a briefing, this is what Justin Trudeau had to say about the latest lockdowns. And here he is, once again, not just blaming the unvaccinated for the lockdowns, for the pandemic, as he's been doing over and over, but now he's blaming the unvaccinated for the fact that Canada's healthcare system can't handle everything that's going on. So the fact that people aren't having the proper cancer treatment, aren't being able to have elective surgeries, all of this is because of the unvaccinated, according to Justin Trudeau. So here is what that looked like.
When people are seeing cancer treatments and elective surgeries put off because beds are filled with people who chose not to get vaccinated, they're frustrated. When people see that we're in lockdowns or serious public health restrictions right now because the risk posed to all of us by unvaccinated people get angry.
So as you can see, it is just so black and white for our Prime Minister. Everything that's happening, everything that's wrong with your life, everything that's going bad in your life, you can just squarely place the blame on one group of people, the unvaccinated. This is the kind of despicable othering that we see, that we've been warned about throughout our lives. Throughout history, we see examples of the sort of we versus them, othering, scapegoating one group of people, making it so that one group of people is to blame for all of society's ills. This is what Justin Trudeau is doing. It is so reckless, is so irresponsible, and of him as a liberal, usually we hear lecturing and warnings of not doing this from liberals, from people like Justin Trudeau. He seems to have abandoned any kind of decorum, of responsibility, any of the old things that he used to say, any of the old rhetoric that he used to say about Canadians being, a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, any of those things. He doesn't seem to think about that or care about that anymore, as long as he can just point the blame on one group of people. Let's just be clear about one thing. The reason that we are locked down right now is because of politicians, because of weak-willed politicians like Doug Ford, like Francois Legault in Quebec, like Justin Trudeau, who can't, they told us that we had to get vaccinated. They told us that vaccine mandates will allow us to keep businesses open, will allow us to stay safe. And then even though we went ahead and did that, even though we went ahead and most Canadians got vaccinated, most Canadians have been abiding by the rules and showing their vaccine passports in order to go to restaurants or bars or gyms or whatever, they're still locking those things down. So no, we're not being locked down right now because of the unvaccinated. We're being locked down right now because of political will, because of the choices that have been made by our politicians, rather than focusing on protecting the most vulnerable, keeping the elderly and people with underlying conditions safe. Instead of that, we have this sort of blanket policy. When the only tool that you have in your tool belt is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. That is exactly what's happening in our society. So no, it's not true that the unvaccinated are to blame. Politicians are to blame. There have been many reports about long waiting lists, people dying in waiting lists because hospitals aren't focusing on keeping people safe in terms of cancer treatment, early detection. People who have health concerns, they haven't been able to go and see them because the hospitals are so overrun by COVID. That isn't, again, the fault of the unvaccinated. It's the fault of our centrally planned, socialized healthcare system that has a complete lack of resources. And again, because of heavy-handed COVID policies, which have closed down doctors' offices, limited hospitals, and because of that, people haven't been able to have sort of the normal screening and the normal protocols when it comes to other illnesses. So again, just really cloudy thinking by our Prime Minister, really simplistic way of just boiling it down, rather than looking at the system, rather than looking at Canada and some of the many flaws that we have with the institutions in this country, particularly when it comes to the socialist infused healthcare system that we have. Rather than having any kind of nuance, any kind of leadership, Trudeau, again, just simply turns around and blames the unvaccinated. It's really gross. And so this all happened the same week as a video resurfaced. This was originally from September 16, 2021, right in the middle of the election campaign. Justin Trudeau appeared on a French language show. Now, we talked about this clip and we went through it all in an earlier episode. I think it was Tuesday episode of the Candice Malcolm Show, but I'll play part of it again because it just shows the anger, the sort of derogatory attitude that Justin Trudeau has towards the unvaccinated. Again, he truly hates these people. And you know, this isn't like, these aren't like an enemy combatants or like a foreign state or an adversarial regime. These are Canadians. These are our fellow Canadians who, for whatever reason, perhaps it's because they've already had COVID and they have natural immunity. Perhaps it's because they're very, very healthy. Perhaps it's because they've had adverse impact from previous vaccines and they don't want to take this one. Or perhaps just skeptical of a big government forcing you to make the health decision that they choose. For whatever reason it is, people who have chosen not to get vaccinated, and Trudeau treats them like they are the enemy. So here's a little bit of what that clip looked like.
Vaccination, qui sont extrémistes, qui croient pas dans la science, qui sont souvent misogynes, souvent racistes aussi. C'est un petit groupe, mais qui prend de la place. Et là, il faut faire un choix en tant que leader, en tant que pays. Est-ce qu'on tolère ces gens-là ou est-ce qu'on dit, ben voyons, la plupart des gens, presque 80% des Québécois ont fait ce qu'il fallait faire, se sont fait vacciner, on veut revenir aux choses qu'on aime faire. C'est pas ces gens-là qui vont nous bloquer maintenant.
And again, it was in French. The subtitles are there, but in case you're not watching or you're listening and you don't understand French, what he said is, they're extremists who don't believe in science. They're often misogynistic, also often racist. It's a small group that muscles in, and we have to make a choice in terms of leaders, in terms of the country. Do we tolerate these people? Or do we say, hey, most of Quebec people, 80% are vaccinated. We want to come back to things we like doing. It's not those people who are blocking us. Again, it's kind of weird that right in the middle of a federal election campaign, he's talking about us, the Quebecois people, instead of us, the Canadian people. It just shows you the mindset of a French Quebecois prime minister. But regardless, again, just saying that if it was only for those 20% of the population that is unvaccinated, everything would be back to normal. We'd be able to just go back to doing the things we like doing, and the only thing standing between you and your freedom are these group of people, those unvaccinated people. They are all to blame. Of course, this isn't true. The stats don't back up what Justin Trudeau is saying here, and we know that fully vaccinated people still get COVID, fully vaccinated people still end up in the hospital, and fully vaccinated people still end up in the ICU. So it's not the silver bullet that Justin Trudeau proclaims it to be. Now, sure, being vaccinated helps. It helps most people protect themselves against COVID, but it doesn't, it's not a magical cure. It's not going to end the pandemic, and the numbers show that. So since the start of the vaccination campaign, which was back in December 2020, here is the data from the Public Health Agency of Canada, and here is what the data looks like for vaccinated versus unvaccinated people getting COVID. So since the start of the pandemic, 76.8% of all COVID cases have been among the unvaccinated, so 727,000 cases. Now, that still leaves a lot of room for the people who are fully vaccinated that have had COVID. So 13% of all the COVID cases in Canada were of people who were fully vaccinated. So 122,843 cases in this country of COVID have been among people who were fully vaccinated and their 14-day inoculation period was over. They had had both doses and they still received COVID. 5.6% of all cases, so that's 53,000 people, were partially vaccinated, and another 4.6% of people were vaccinated. But they hadn't had their 14-day period of full inoculation. So again, basically partially vaccinated. That's 43,000. So we're talking here about 24% of all COVID cases in this country have been among the vaccinated. So it isn't as simplistic as Trudeau explains. And you can see the graph here showing the difference here between the hospitalization rate and death rate of people who are vaccinated versus unvaccinated. If you look at the data in Ontario, though, it's pretty interesting because it almost shows a different situation. This is the current numbers, and I'm not going to pretend that I can explain why this is so different, but I think it's worth pointing out. So if you look at the cases of people in the hospital right now in Ontario, look at this graph. Nearly 3/4 of the people who are in the hospital right now are either fully vaccinated, that's 1,073 cases, or partially vaccinated, that's 108. The number of people in hospital right now who are unvaccinated is only 417 of the cases. So that shows basically the exact opposite of what the federal numbers look like, the exact opposite of what Justin Trudeau is saying. Now, I'm not sure if this is because it's Omicron that is really hammering Ontario right now, and a lot of people who get Omicron are fully vaccinated, but we're told that fully vaccinated, that the vaccinations don't cover you the same way against Omicron. But still pretty interesting when you look down at the ICU. It's pretty much split half and half. So of the people in the ICU right now, about 100 of them are either fully vaccinated or partially vaccinated, and 109 of them are unvaccinated. So still more unvaccinated, but not the black and white case that Justin Trudeau would suggest. And Justin Trudeau wasn't done with blaming and shaming Canadians and really deflecting all the blame away from himself. You probably saw this story. It's pretty amusing. It's all over the news right now. The Canadian media just jump on this story like it's the biggest scandal that has ever happened to our country. Rather than holding the politicians accountable, rather than holding Justin Trudeau and his cabinet accountable, rather than focusing in on scandal of the people who actually have power in the society, the government, the corporations, big pharma, instead of doing any of that, our media are now holding a group of kids, a group of Quebec influencers accountable for something that they did on a private chartered plane. This story is just so ridiculous. Video captures partying passengers maskless on a Sunwing flight to Mexico. I just love the pearl clutching here. Like, oh my goodness, they were maskless. Okay, let me just make a few points about this story because I find it so ridiculous. Okay, first of all, imagine being 20 years old right now. Imagine being a person who just finished high school, going to college, wanting to live a normal life, have some fun, go out there and meet people, and just enjoy their youth in the way that most people have the opportunity to do, except for that they can't because they've lived through COVID lockdowns, everything about a normal life and normal adolescence, being able to go out and socialize with your friends, go to parties, go out to bars, blow off some steam. All of that stuff basically hasn't been available for this generation of people. So what do? They charter a private plane to get the hell out of Canada, to go out, go have some fun, enjoy the sun, go do their thing, right? I don't judge people. This is one aspect where I'm pretty libertarian. I think that young people should be able to have fun, especially in this case. They chartered the flight. They're going to Mexico. They weren't even in Canadian airspace, okay? These people are just having fun. And somehow this turned into the biggest scandal in the world. And I love the fact that the media loves to emphasize the fact that they were maskless and they weren't socially distancing. I can't imagine caring about this story. I can't imagine this story being something that upsets you or bothers you, or you would think that this should be a national story. I mean, the fact that they chartered the plane, look, when I first saw the videos, I thought, okay, if this is a commercial flight and there's other people on board who might be feeling pretty uncomfortable by the fact that these kids are partying, I could understand how that would be a problem and that these people would have broken a bunch of rules. But they didn't. They chartered the flight. It's a private flight. You can do whatever, you can't do whatever you want on a private flight, but there's a lot more leeway. And from the videos, it doesn't look like there's anyone, like a flight attendant, trying to fight back, or it doesn't seem like there's any kind of a struggle on board. It seems like it was all sort of condoned, and they were on the PA system. They were just having a good time. And the fact that this is a scandal is so ridiculous. And of course, Justin Trudeau wants to chime in because it's a perfect opportunity to deflect away from his record, deflect away from his own governance, and blame someone else. In this case, blame a bunch of Quebec influencers who are having a good time, partying and, blowing off steam, going a little crazy on a flight. And so we have Justin Trudeau jumping in to scold them and, again, make it seem like somehow these kids who aren't even in Canada, they left the country, they weren't in Canadian airspace, they're now in Mexico. Somehow these people are responsible for the lockdowns and surging cases in Canada. Doesn't make any sense. But here is what Justin Trudeau had to say.
I can assure you that Transport Canada is taking the situation extremely seriously. There will be a full investigation into exactly what went on in this situation. I think, like all Canadians who've seen those videos, I'm extremely frustrated. We know how hard people have worked to keep themselves safe, to limit their family gatherings at Christmas time, to wear masks, to get vaccinated, to do all the right things. And it's a slap in the face to see people putting themselves, putting their fellow citizens, putting airline workers at risk by being completely irresponsible. I can assure you that this is a situation that Transport Canada takes extremely seriously, and we are definitely following up on that.
It's a slap in the face. I don't understand. If there was just a video of a bunch of kids partying in Mexico, it wouldn't have anything to do with Canada, even if they're Canadians. It's not a slap in the face. They weren't putting their fellow passengers and countrymen at risk because everybody on the plane was in the same group. Presumably, they all consented to this idea that they were going to be on a flight together, that they were going to be partying. And let me just say, when I was in university, I went to the University of Alberta in Edmonton. I was on part of the ski group. We would go on different trips almost every weekend to different mountains in and around Alberta and BC. And the scene on that plane didn't look too dissimilar to the scene on a bus at the University of Alberta going to one of these mountains. We'd leave on a Friday afternoon and it was pretty much always a party. Sometimes it was annoying that people were partying, but it's also all part of being young. And the idea that somehow this impacts the whole country, this is something that the Prime Minister needs to comment on and needs to scold these people. To me, it's just so hypocritical too. Do you think for one second the Prime Minister wasn't doing stuff like this when he was in his 20s, that he wasn't out there partying? I mean, we've seen pictures of the guy at beer gardens and partying. We all know what happened at the Kokanee Musical Festival out there in Cranbrook when he groped a reporter. I mean, it's just so ridiculous hearing this guy, put on his serious voice and scold a bunch of young people who weren't even in Canada at the time for having a good time. Give me a break. Give me a break. And it gets worse because, as much as he was scolding them in English, he went even further in French. Trudeau called these Sunwind travelers idiots and barbarians in French. They're idiots and they're barbarians. Some way to talk about your fellow Canadian there, pal. Calling young Canadians who are blowing off steam because you've locked them down for 2 years, calling them idiots and barbarians. Good for you. Good for you, Justin Trudeau. I'm sure you feel so good about yourself. Virtue signaling there and coming down on a bunch of young people. And the funniest thing about all this is the people in those videos, the kids, the Quebec people, they're influencers, right? Their whole job, their whole existence is to be popular online, to get attention. That's all they want. That's all an influencer wants, is just to kind of have a video that goes viral, get a bunch of new Instagram followers. So this is all kind of feeding into what these people want. They want fame, they want attention, they want the clicks, and this is the media, the Prime Minister, this whole charade. They're giving them exactly what they want. So even though they're coming down on these kids, the kids are actually the winners of all this because they're getting what they want, which is attention. So we could talk about the hypocrisy of Justin Trudeau, how he used to behave when he was in his 20s versus how he's scolding these Quebec influencers today. But you don't even have to go back that far to see the hypocrisy with Justin Trudeau. I mean, go back, a few months here, back in October 2021. Here is Justin Trudeau in Amsterdam partying with elites with no masks, no social distancing. Was this a slap in the face, Justin Trudeau? You're allowed to go to a party. You're allowed to go to a bar. You're allowed to not wear a mask and not socially distance, and hey, he's not in Canada either, but when these young Quebec influencers do it, it's a slap in the face. It's of course not the first time Justin Trudeau has done it. So here is Justin Trudeau. He's got a drink in hand. He is laughing and chumming it up shoulder to shoulder with world elites at the G7 meeting over in the UK in June 2021. And we saw it. We saw it throughout the entire election campaign. The election campaign basically just featured a bunch of politicians breaking the rules that they are imposing that you follow. So back in August 2021, Justin Trudeau dodges questions on breaking gathering limits during a packed campaign stop. Here's what that looked like. Justin Trudeau at a huge, busy election rally. So he's allowed to be there. He's not wearing a mask. He's allowed to be hand gladding and shaking hands and kissing babies and doing the whole election campaign stuff. Breaking the rules, breaking his own social distancing rules, but again, not following the rules that he sets. Here he is in September 2021. Trudeau breaks the law once again by ignoring Ontario's COVID restrictions. This was over in the Toronto Sun, covering a packed Liberal rally in Brampton during the election. Once again, Trudeau was packed with more than 400 people into a banquet hall, no socially distanced, no attempts whatsoever. This was the second time Trudeau has held an event in violation of Ontario's COVID-19 regulations while claiming to follow them. The first time was 2 weeks ago in Mississauga when he was in a packed small restaurant. So once again, we see Justin Trudeau doing this all the time. And now here he is, putting on his serious face, acting like he's completely appalled, calling them idiots and barbarians for doing basically what Justin Trudeau has done all along. And, this goes back right to the beginning of the pandemic. Recall that back in June 2020, Justin Trudeau attended a huge so-called anti-racism, anti-Black racism march where he went and he infamously took a knee and joined the Black Lives Matter campaign right at the time when they were trying to convince Canadians that we had to continue to shelter in place, continue to stay inside. The 14 days to curb the spread of COVID at this point had now turned into like 3 months. And there's Justin Trudeau leaving self-isolation at Rideau Cottage to attend a massive anti-racism protest in Ottawa. And he even had his own department write talking points for him that came from an ATIP from our friends over at Rebel News that basically he was told to say that the reason that he skirted the COVID rules at the time was that supposedly anti-Black racism and racism against Indigenous people and other minorities negatively affects their health and safety. That was sort of the first glimpse that we got about how much of a farce this whole lockdown thing was, that they made special exemptions if you were protesting for righteous causes, if you were joining the trendy left movements there, that you were allowed to skirt COVID laws. So throughout this entire pandemic, and particularly now, what we see from Justin Trudeau is the same thing. Total hypocrisy, going out of his way to condemn and blame the unvaccinated, or in this case, blame some Quebec influencers who are out there having a good time, blaming them, not taking any responsibility for his own policies, ignoring the fact that he too often breaks COVID rules and breaks the same standards that he is condemning other people for breaking. Well, when it comes to Justin Trudeau and the pandemic and his handling of this entire thing all along, it has been rules for thee, but not for me. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.